It's my great pleasure to welcome Pierre MONNIN for this keynote. So Pierre is a senior fellow at Council on Economic Policies and is currently visiting professor at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment at the London School of Economics. His work focuses on monetary policy and financial regulation and the link of these two aspects with environmental and social sustainability. So Pierre is going to present today a paper that was written with Nick Robbins from the LSE. And the paper is entitled Supporting the Just Transition, a Roadmap for Central Banks and Supervisors. So after Pierre's presentation, we will have a panel discussion so that I will moderate. So Pierre, the floor is yours, and thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Can you hear me well? I guess yes. And let me try to share my screen so you can have my presentation. Can you see it? I guess so. Yeah. Okay, so thank you. Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay. A little bit of a technical glitch. Many thanks to the organizers and Laurent in particular for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present our work with Nick in this session. I apologize for not being able to be in the room with you today. I had several engagements this week that made it difficult for me to travel to Paris. And you know, this keynote is introducing a session about the challenges and opportunities of the just transition at large. But I will begin this session and in this keynote by focusing on two specific actors that are concerned by the just transition, central banks and financial supervisors. So what I would like to present to you today is why the just transition matters for them, how they can contribute to it, and what are the challenges they face in taking the next steps in supporting the just transition. So as Laurent highlighted, this presentation is based on a paper that I wrote with Nick Robbins from the LSE. However, I might depart a bit in my presentation of what has been written in this paper. So yeah, please don't blame Nick for my ideas. I know he shares many of them, but it's basically my own comments for this meeting. So just before focusing on central banks and financial regulators, I just wanted to highlight that the just transition is high now on the international policy agenda. So already in the Paris Agreement, it is highlighted. So the imperative of a just transition are highlighted. It's another arcane theme in the agreement. This has been also re-emphasized in the last COP and in the Glasgow Agreement. On other fronts, you know, just transition is also recurrently mentioned in G20's leaders' declaration. In particular, most of these declarations support a sustainable and inclusive green and just transitions. And it has also reflected in several working groups in the G20, especially the Sustainable Finance Working Group, which stresses the importance of an orderly, just and affordable transition. So this is the background. Internationally, you may ask, why do we want to focus on central banks and supervisors in this context? So the just transition is a global effort for many policymakers. So why central banks and supervisors? And then just to motivate that, I would like to quote here a speech by Ravi Menon, who is the governor of the monetary authority of Singapore, and he's also the chair of the NGFS currently. So in a speech entitled "Net Zero: Act Now, Act Fast, and Act Together," Ravi Menon really emphasized the need to act together and saying that the challenge of the just transition is too big for governments or country alone to solve it, and then that we need a global effort and a whole of a society approach in each country to solve it, and that basically we need an effective partnership across public, private, and people to mobilize the financing for an effective and just transition. So for me, this central banks and supervisors should not be carved out of this effort, and they are important actors in shaping financial markets and also thus in shaping the funding that is going to an effective and just transition. So they are part of this public effort, and what I would like to do in this presentation is to say how I think they should contribute to it. Just before that, just transition, is understood very differently from different people. We don't really use a specific definition of what just transition is, but I highlighted here the one that I like the most, which comes from the Scottish government, and which define a just transition is that the government must design policies to ensure that the benefit of climate change action are shared widely, so to share the benefits, but also to make sure that the costs do not fare unfairly on, do not burden unfairly those who are the least able to pay and those that are directly or indirectly at risk of the economy and shifts and changes that we will see. So a transition, even if it's good on aggregate for the economy and for all, there is winner and losers in this transition, and we should also look at this aspect in designing it and making sure that the losers will still be able to take part of this movement. And I think that's very important, because if we don't have a just transition, we will probably not have a transition, because we're very likely to see people that lose the most of it not taking part of the political process and support the measures that we need for the transition. So this is just a few words to set the scene. Now, what I would like to do quickly now is to explain to you why the just transition matter for central banks and financial supervisors, and then present a roadmap that we've devised with Nick, a roadmap which is based on 3 pillars: assess, advise, and act, and then present you the challenges in implementing this roadmap, and as well as the way ahead and the next steps. So first, why does the just transition matters for central banks? So it's important to realize that the just transition it has a crossroad of 2 themes that are quite important for central banks recently. These 2 themes is the green transition and inequality. So here I just showed you that central banks have talked more and more about the green transition. Like the dotted point in blue here are the mention of central banks and climate change in the FT articles, and the line is the tweets mentioning these 2 themes. So we see that since 2018, central banks and the green transition are much more talked about. And we have a similar picture for inequality. So here you have graphs of the references to inequality in central banker speech. And you see also that in the last decade, central banks make much more reference to inequality. So that's just, being talked about is not only what central banks have done about climate change and inequality, they also have acted. And especially in terms of the transition to a green economy, central banks have really worked a lot on what they could do. And to sum up, I think the conclusion of many central banks now is that central banks and supervisors have their own interest in supporting the green transition. And their own interests come from different angles. First, the transition to a low carbon economy strengthens financial stability. So many central banks have highlighted that between a scenario of a transition, an orderly transition, and a scenario of no transition at all, the transition is a scenario that guarantees financial stability the most. So if we have no transition, then we will probably see a lot of financial instability. So in a sense, seeing the transition happen is good for financial stability, which is core part of central bank's activity, as we have seen in the last days. But the transition also potentially strengthens price and economic stability. So there are also studies that show that central banks will be in a much more comfortable situation in terms of controlling inflation if there is a transition. There will be less external shocks to the economy and to price. So it's also better for price and economic stability to have a transition. On top of that, some central banks have sustainability goals in their mandate. And if they are like the ECB as a secondary goal of supporting like the environmental policies of the Union, and when central banks and financial supervisors have this goal in their mandate, then they have an interest in supporting the transition, and also the right or the duty to do it because of their mandate. And finally, which is also important, the transition will probably also mitigate the risk that central banks have in their balance sheet. So like any other financial institution, central banks have risk in their balance sheet, and physical climate risk are large, or could be large, and a transition is one way to mitigate these risks in their balance sheet. So this is quite established fact for central banks. When it comes to inequality, this is less established. So central banks are only starting to turn to inequality issues, especially since we have a return of inflation, which highlight inequality consequences of monetary policy. So it's less established, but what I would like to say here is that central banks, I think, also have an own interest in mitigating inequality for several reasons. First, inequality challenge the effectiveness of monetary policy. In that sense, you know, the distribution of income and wealth is central to the transmission of monetary policy, and higher inequality can potentially obstruct the transmission of monetary policy stimulus to the economy. And the intuition to understand that is that in an unequal society, income is concentrated in the hand of a few, and the consumption of these few is largely insensitive to interest rate change. So those who react more to monetary policy, to changing interest rate, and are rather at the bottom of the income distribution, and they need to be included to relay in markets, in financial market, and in labor market, to relay the stimulus that low interest rates provide. And we have evidence that in a sense, higher inequality tend to clog monetary policy transmission. Similar to climate change, I think inequality also challenges financial stability. There are studies that shows that financial stability tend to be higher in financial instability tend to be higher in an unequal society for several reasons. I will not comment on more on that, but you can find also in the literature kind of evidence for that. I think inequality also challenge their mandate. A lot of central banks have a mandate of inclusive economy, for example, and obviously higher inequality is not in line with such objective in their mandate when they have them. And finally, I would say that inequality also challenges their independence. So independence is important for central bank, but to remain independent, they need a support from the population at large that support their independence against other policymakers or financial market. And I think that in a fragmented society, this support to the central banks is likely to erode. So higher inequality is also not good for the independence of central banks. So that's the reason why central bank could act in supporting the transition and also a just transition. What we suggest with Nick for that is a roadmap made in 3 acts: assess, advise, and act. And our conclusions are based a lot on the NGFS work, the work that NGFS has done on the green transition. So I highlighted here 5 reports that NGFS has done, but there are many others. And I think a lot of the conclusions and solutions that the NGFS has devised for the green transition could also be applied for a just transition or serve as basis of thinking about a just transition. So what are the steps that we suggest? First is an assessment duty for central banks and financial regulators. So we have to realize that central banks and supervisors are exceptionally well placed to understand the dynamics of distribution and how it interacts with financial system. They have a lot of data. In many countries, they have a lot of also capacities in terms of staff and knowledge. So there are key actors that can highlight and understand how distributional issues and transition issues interact with financial system in the economy. So they're also very well placed to assess these consequences on macroeconomic and price dynamics. And I think one big contribution that central banks and financial supervisors could have in this domain is to improve public knowledge. So make research, share this research, educate also different actors on the market. So improve the public knowledge and also, disclose or create key economic data sets regarding the interaction between distributional issues and the transition, so that everybody has the tools and the data at hand to take the right decisions. Especially, I'm thinking here about other policymakers that could rely on central banks' research to take decisions. A second thing that we recommend is for central banks to advise. So here it is clear for us that governments are primarily responsible for setting the economic and fiscal framework for the just transition. However, we think that central banks and supervisors can contribute to setting this framework. They can support the development of the economic and fiscal frameworks of other economic agencies through dialogue, through their expertise, and also through advocacy with government and other agencies, highlighting why a just transition could make sense, how policy can be implemented. And a second aspect, I think they can also advise, support, and feed into many national and international collective initiatives around the just transition, either triggering this collective initiative or contributing to them, again, with their expertise and advocacy. So here we can think about work at the G20 level, but also work at the national level. Finally, we also recommend central banks to act. Here we can distinguish between macro measure, and that I would think touches 3 big themes, which is employment. So employment is a key objective for many central banks, and sometimes it's an objective that is explicitly mentioned in the mandates. And here we could think about setting higher priority to employment objectives when central banks weigh them against other objectives of financial stability or inflation, because employment is the main way through which monetary policy is having an equalizing impact on society. We could also think about another objective of macro objective of central banks, which is inflation. So we've seen this very recently how inflation can be have large distributional consequences. Low-income households suffer much more for inflation than high-income households. And here, for example, central banks could distinguish between inflation experienced by different groups in the population and maybe put a higher weight on controlling low-income inflation or taking the right measure for that. We also think that central banks can act in a targeted way. So here is the solution in terms of monetary policy operation that central banks have highlighted in the context of the transition to a low-carbon economy. So there are many solutions on how central banks can use their operation to support the transition. And we think that a lot of parallel could be made in terms of also supporting a just transition. So most of these measures are targeted to give an incentive for economic activities or an indirect incentive for economic activities that support the transition. We could also think of focusing even more on economic activities that have both a transition aspect, but also a support in terms of creating quality employment in sectors that are aligned with the transition. So, for example, just for you to know, the Bank of Japan is buying stocks as part of its monetary policy. And the Bank of Japan is using an index where companies that are creating jobs and that are investing in building up capacities of their employees, these companies get bit up. So the Bank of Japan buy a bit more of these companies to try to support them relative to other companies. So that's a simple example. Now, of course, this sounds very nice. There are challenges if we want, or if central banks and supervisors wants to implement what we recommend. The few challenges that have been highlighted are usually that monetary policy is too blunt of an instrument to support a just transition. So monetary policy typically relies on aggregate instruments like the interest rate or the exchange rate. And this affects the economy on aggregate, but not really target specific economic activities. That is true. However, many central banks have already used monetary policy operation to have a targeted impact. And this can be done like in the context of a macroeconomic policy with some targeted measure. And we think here we could try to explore more this targeted measure for the just transition. Another challenge is that the instruments that central banks and supervisors usually use have a marginal impact on the just transition. This is true. It's only an indirect impact on economic activities that support the just transition. However, we think that this is still a contribution that central bank can make in a broader policy package for the just transition. And we can also try to focus on the measures that have the most impact on specific just transition dimension. Finally, here there is also a challenge that maybe sometimes supporting the just transition can conflict with other objectives. For example, now raising interest rate is needed for inflation, might be less needed for financial stability, but it's needed for inflation. But the corollary of raising interest rate is that it's not slow down the transition by making investment in the transition more expensive. So here I think the central bank should really weigh the different conflicts, the possible trade-off that they face, and to find solution. Again, here I think maybe targeted operation could be a solution. So let me finish with the next steps that we would like to see, and that's my own wish list. So it's not it's just what I think would make sense as next step for central bank and supervisors. I think a key point is to improve their own knowledge and also the common knowledge of especially distributional issues when it comes to economy, financial system, and monetary policies, the interaction between them, how they influence each other, and also better know what is the impact of central bank action, what are on inequality issues, for example, but also what are the alternatives that they could use, which are often not really looked at. A third point that we think is important is to support the development and the implementation of just transition financial instruments and practices in the financial sector. This is especially true for financial supervisors. There are financial instruments that the whole market can use to support just transition. There are also practices in terms of risk and asset management that market participant can use, and financial supervisor could support such tools and such practices, highlighting them or even setting some expectation for them. And finally, we could also think of something broader than the NGFS. So the NGFS has made a tremendous work in understanding the green transition and showing what central banks can do for that. So what I suggest is to do the same work for the just transition. So from NGFS to NIJT, as I said. So basically, maybe having a central bank and supervisors network for implementing the just transition to better highlight what are the possibilities and recommend practices for central banks and supervisors. So let me stop here. Sorry again for the technical glitch in the beginning. I'm happy to get also the comment on the panel on all this.
Okay, thank you very much, Pierre. So we will try to broaden a bit the scope, because your focus was on central banks and less supervision, I would say, more central banks so far. But we will touch upon the issue also with the industry view. So in this panel, I will have the great pleasure of welcoming Patricia CRIFO. So Patricia is a professor at Ecole Polytechnique. She's also holding several positions related to energy for climate, sustainable finance, responsible investment. Her research has focused on climate and sustainable finance, corporate governance, corporate and social environmental responsibility. Then we will have Marguerite CULOT. So Marguerite is in charge of the partnership and the program of the Institut de la Finance Durable. So Institut de la Finance Durable is a new institute that was created, I think, by Paris Europlace in the aftermath of a report that was published a year ago by Yves Perrier. This report emphasized the role of Paris' financial place in the financing of transition and to a low-carbon economy. Then we will have Stéphane Voisin. So Stéphane is in charge of sustainable finance research and green data intelligence, so very related in a way to the scope designed by Pierre at Institut Louis Bachelier. And Karen DEGOUVE is finally director in charge of climate and sustainable policies at the French Banking Federation, and she's a member of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So all these people, panelists, will touch upon the issue of just transition in the context of of the financial industry, and the issue of why, because that was a bit a point made by Pierre, why just transition is so far not really at the core of the topic on transition. So I will start by asking Patricia to react and to present her own views on the issue.
Do you hear me? Ça marche? Oui. Okay. Thank you very much, Laurent, for giving me the floor. I will make use of Pierre's presentation. I will refer to what he says because I have many insights that are very similar to what has been said, and I will make a focus on the just transition from the research perspective that I have in my work. Around three main dimensions, I think that it was very inspiring to hear Pierre saying that really the just transition represents a significant shift in the climate action of the central banks, and that's really something that I've been witnessing over the past years, as all of you also. And the notion has been said was already in the Paris Agreement, and it is important that because the current context of rising inflation, it's in the last part of Pierre's speech, really make things much more complex now than ever. Rising inflation comes from multiple sources, from the disruption of value chains during the pandemic, to the supply-demand imbalance in the aftermath of the crisis, and now with the geopolitics and war in Ukraine, we have rising energy price, and also those rising energy price also come in part from what we can call a greenflation mechanism. So how to reconcile and how to overcome the challenge of just transition is really something at a very important part. So fundamentally, the just transition, my perspective on the topic is really to reconcile two dimensions and to articulate them over time, overcoming the climate crisis and creating new economic opportunities while preserving social justice and limiting inequality. So from this point of view, there has been a recent trend in the standardization, for instance, of ESG data. And I think this standardization is important because it's precisely question how to reconcile environmental and social and governance issues. These standards, these new standards that are emerging, are supported by many actors and also by numerous academic studies. So it's really something that I think can be interesting from the topics. What is the goal of this ESG standard in terms of reconciling two main dimensions, environmental and social on the one hand? My point of view as an economist is that there are two dimensions that are very important for the transition in terms of social justice that need to be addressed. The first one is the distributional, sorry about the French wording of it, the distributional justice components, according to which the burden, the environmental risks are not shared equally by all stakeholders. So there is something in terms of distribution of environmental risks that needs to be addressed. That's the first dimension. The second dimension, from an economist viewpoint, is the procedural aspect of justice, according to which people, all stakeholders, all people do not have the same opportunities. It's rather a matter of opportunities and not not only distribution. They do not have the same opportunities to change, to influence decisions regarding environmental risk and energy transition. So those two dimensions, distribution and procedure, can be addressed, for instance, at the company level, and can make use of standardization of ESG data. And behind that, the fundamental question is whether those two dimensions, environmental and social, go hand in hand or are fighting and are conflicting. And so research on these topics can help address the complementarities or the conflicts between the environmental and social dimension. And to finish, I don't want to be too long. Let me highlight two examples for which we can check whether environmental and social dimension goes hand in hand, focusing at the firm level. A first example is when we open the black box of governance, social and environmental issues at the firm level. There is an important trend is to incorporate employee into governance decisions. That's something that has been promoted, for instance, in France by the Pact Law. But France, paradoxically, is the last country in Europe to go in this direction. It was the last arrived, and it's the lowest performing one. To give you some figures, only 15% of the seats inside the board company are open to employee representatives in France, whereas in almost 20 out of 27 European countries, it's 30%. So we are very far away from our European partners on that topics. We are not very open to employees. But opening the governance decision layer to employees is very important because it creates a new kind of democracy inside the companies that is not liberal but rather social. And the data shows that when we open those seats to employees, in fact, environmental performance improves in companies. So that's something that can help reconcile environmental and social dimension at the firm level and help implementing the just transition at the firm level. The second example I wanted to highlight is regarding the compensation of executives. It is something that is very important. Every year we hear about that when we approach the General Assembly meetings. It's a topic which is very controversial in France, but not only in France, in many of our partners as well. And as for the employee participation in decision making, there has been a trend recently in all OECD countries to index executive remuneration to ESG bonus. That's a very important trend. In terms of figures, it represents 30% of the companies worldwide do that. 70% of the CAC 40 companies do it. So it's really something that seems to be adopted and implemented widely. What are the impact of it? Well, in companies that have implemented those bonus, the impacts are quite disappointing. So it's not really the miracle solution to improve environmental and social performance, unless the system of the governance and the alignments of environmental, social, and governance goals inside the companies is consistent, and unless, for instance, employees also have their voice in how those bonuses are set. So when this is the case, when you have both executive but also employees having their words on these topics, then environmental performance improves and also financial performance of the company. So I was a bit long. I hope I did not jeopardize everybody, but it was just to make this focus on those two dimensions as, positive examples of how those two dimensions, environmental and social, can go in the same direction, provided that we have the right incentives and that we have the right decisions at the firm level. Thank you very much.
So, Marguerite, can you explain us what Institut de la Finance Durable can do to foster the just transition in the financial industry and Paris financial place?
Yes, I will be pleased to. So just a quick remark. It's the Institut de la Finance Durable was former Financial for Tomorrow, so it's just not a new organization, but it's just, the organization just changed the name, yeah. We've been working within the Institut de la Finance Durable for a few years, just after the yellow vest crisis in France, which was, I think, in 2019, 2020. it was just big demonstration. I don't know if you remember that, but people were blocking the roundabouts and roads because of carbon tax that government wanted to impose to everybody without distinction, without redistribution. And that's what you said, Patricia. It's really important to have this social focus when you want to change law or want to impose some taxes for climate. And so they at that moment, I suppose that many people in France, as everywhere else, I think, in the world, because everybody was looking at France at this moment, like today, I guess. It was a big issue, and they say, okay, we can't succeed the green shift, or we can't succeed the climate challenge and energy shift without consider social issues and social consequences of this, because of course there are big consequences, and probably on the more vulnerable people, so on the poorest, which really are the most impacted persons. And at this moment, I suppose that the financial institution, as well as other members of Institut de la Finance Durable, because we are gathering FIs, but also corporates and data providers and consultancies and public authorities, were just thinking about what we can do. Maybe we have to think about what is just transition first, because there were not a clear definition agreed by everyone, even if ILO, the International Labour Organization, had already a definition. It's just transition appeared like in the 70s, I guess, if I remember well, because in the US, and because of the first environmental law. And so we had a past on this concept, but it was not very clear that we need to address social issues, which means work, labor force issues and employees issues, but also consumers, also local communities, citizens issue when you think about transition to a greener business model, for example, when you talk about corporates. And so the FIs and all the ecosystem of Institut de la Finance Durable just worked without work streams about this. What is just transition? What are the consequences on these various stakeholders? We just draft position paper, and then after we said maybe we need to do more, and with some investors we decided to create a coalition of investors for just transition. As in many coalitions, the goal of this initiative was to talk with corporates and try to understand better how the corporates understand just transition and how they implement real just transition policies when they shift towards green business model. So I think it was like 24 investors gather within this coalition. The Institut de la Finance Durable is coordinating this coalition, is being coordinated this coalition for 1.5 years now. We engage 30 corporates from 4 sectors, like the main sectors which are really impacted by the need to shift quite fast towards a green business model. So it's like the transport, energy, of course, agro-food, and building, construction, and materials. And we're just in the middle of this engagement dialogue for now. But so I'm not going to say the conclusion of this action, but I would say that all the corporates know that they need to shift, they need to reduce to mitigate, the greenhouse gas emissions. They need to adapt, they need to take care and consider reskill, upskill their work labor. They know that they need to take care of their the local communities. They need to shift really, but sometimes they just don't think properly how to do it, as well as I think sometimes they don't have the same definition of just transition, meaning taking care of citizens, but also employees, but also suppliers, but also local communities. So they just sometimes have just a human rights approach, and that's it. And it's not enough, clearly, as you said. But it's just the dialogue is there, and the investors of the coalition try to move forward with the corporates, and hopefully at this end of year we will have position paper or like a proof of concept, and we will keep on acting with them on having this dialogue, because of course we can't transform in one day, and just transition is really a complex issue. So it's not thinking the same way if you are an agro-food corporate and the value chain is really long in some sectors. So you really have to think precisely on what is the corporates, what is their way of doing business, and try to change step by step with them to integrate this just transition issues.
Thank you, Marguerite. Stéphane, you want to react to what Marguerite and Patricia said?
Yes, but first of all, I would like to tell you how happy I am to be part of a truly gender-balanced panel. And I think we're setting the benchmark, and you should take lots of pictures, because this should be the benchmark for the next risk forum. On this, what at Institut Louis Bachelier, we're trying obviously to support Institut de la Finance Durable, to set up a new research program on just transition, trying, and I think this is why Pierre Monnin's paper is very important, and Nick Robbins' paper is very important, try not to focus only on the downstream issue, looking at corporates, looking at the consequences, the negative consequences of the just transition, but trying to look upstream on what's going on. And actually, this just transition agenda most of the times reminds me of this joke that you all know about the drunk who is looking under a lamp spot for a key that he has lost on the other side of the street, because that's where the light is. And you know, this is an observational bias known as the streetlight effect, or the drunkard search principle that we know very well. And what I mean is that it strikes me most of the time that the just transition agenda just focus on the downstream consequences of the low carbon trajectory, when it should actually look at search for solution in the design of the trajectory itself, because this is precisely where we lost the social issues. So the question is, as Laurent said, where we lost them and why we lost them. And if we go back upstream in the alignment methodological pathway, we see integrated models that are used to generate scenarios that do actually take into account social consideration and a number of distributional issues and social issues. But they are pretty much blind on social justice issues inside the regions that they describe, for the obvious reason that they are too aggregated. At the national level, we can, in this type of models and scenarios, we can run models through macro, micro coupling exercise that could potentially address just transition issues, but we don't. Then the problem, the final problem, is that when we convert these models and these scenarios in trajectories and in alignment tools such as SBTIs, the social considerations have totally disappeared. We have basically lost them in translations. So at the end of the day, that's why SBTI, PACTA, ACT, and most net zero frameworks that we know are completely blind when it comes to social, labor, and unfairness consideration. So as a result of this blindness, the market has no choice than to look downstream to the remediation solution to the negative effect of the low-carbon transition. This is why we focus on corporate and how corporates can protect basically their workforce, how governments can protect households against energy poverty, but we don't go upstream. If you want to make sure that no one is left behind, as Pierre mentioned, I think we should act upstream in the design of the trajectory and do not wait for the consequences of the transition that will obviously be painful since we did not take them into consideration in the first place. In fact, the problem comes to a very simple question. Can we design a low carbon trajectory that takes into account social related factors and not only climate related one? In other words, how can we take into account social justice by adjusting the burden sharing mechanism? It always strikes me that when we look at all the just transition papers, we never make any reference to the burden sharing mechanisms. And this is precisely where the social issues should be integrated. So a few reasons, maybe I'd like to drop a few reasons why we don't, and I'm sure I won't be exhaustive, but I think one obvious reason is that most of the stakeholders do not want to see the social issues as an excuse not to reduce the burden of the climate issues, obviously, and that's quite right. It shouldn't be a pretext. The second reason is what I will call inequality duplicities, that at the end of the day, if we do implement a really holistic ways in integrating the social issues, you're going to come in a world where basically you will have to, the richest will have to pay for the poorest. And this is, absolutely what it should, the consequences of that, and which come with another consequences specifically for investors about basically rebalancing value sharing. At the corporate level, a just transition plan ultimately means for the corporates that you have to arbitrage between your workers and your shareholders. And I'm not sure this is totally in the self-interest of the investor, obviously. So I will stop there just to precise, but also maybe finally to make a point on what Pierre says and what Nick and Pierre says, because I think if we go back upstream to the problems and we do embed the social effect into the design of the trajectory, into the scenarios, we will substantially reduce the ability of any stress test to assess the financial materiality of the various pathways, because we do know that social justice crises can turn into financial crises much faster than climate change crisis.
Thank you, Stéphane. So the last speaker is Karen DEGOUVE. So Karen, the industry and especially banks have taken some steps to develop transition plans. So could you explain what are the objectives and whether and how just transition is taken on board by these initiatives? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So speaking from a commercial banking perspective, and as Laurent said, I'm also part of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which is a coalition of 126 banks, I think now, to date, which represents roughly 40% of the total global banking assets in the world across 41 countries. So it's a very large coalition of the willing of banks who have committed to reach net zero by 2050. So that's what the alliance is. And as part of that alliance, banks who have committed to that, founders almost 2 years ago already, have committed to set targets to reach net zero of their portfolio by 2050, set intermediary targets by 2030 or earlier, and then every 5 years on 9 key most carbon-intensive sectors. And they have also committed to disclose their progress to targets and to put in action transition plans. And that's the last brick, I would say, of that commitment, because for the founding members who have signed up in April 2021, they still have the cut-off date for publishing and disclosing their transition plan actually falls sometime this year for the first sectors, and sometime next year, by mid-next year, for the rest of the carbon-intensive sectors. So we're in the middle of that work being done. So that's for the timing. So the NZBA methodology is not prescriptive, so there's no methodology, basically. It's left to each of the banks who've signed up to that coalition to decide how they actually put in pace that commitment, at what pace they actually reach that target, what trajectory, what benchmarks they use for each of the sectors. At the French banking level, we have worked towards developing a common approach for French banks to approach the transition in a similar way. I would not say it's not binding for banks to follow, but at least it gives a guidance. And what's interesting to see is that within NZBA today, so NZBA is the acronym for Net Zero Banking Alliance, there's no mention of social impacts, there's no mention of just transition. And because I was in the discussion in the early days for drafting the guidelines for NZBA, I can tell you that this subject was approached. I mean, it was mentioned in the conversation, and the reason it's not there, it's because it's easy in a way to agree on a net zero target, because the underlying measure is a ton of carbon, and if you emit a ton of carbon in France or in China or in South Africa, it has basically the same global impact. Evaluating the social impact of any action that you do is not similar. And it has a very different definition depending on which perspective you take and which part of the world you're sitting in. So it was totally impossible to include in that global coalition that has the ambition to be completely global, including all banking activities from all countries, and we can regret that there's not a single Chinese bank in that coalition. And I can tell you that if we had included just transition or social impacts in the target of that alliance, it would be even harder to have all banks globally involved. So it's very complicated to have a common definition. That's, to me, one of the key reasons why it's not there. It doesn't mean that there's not a willing to achieve just transition at the same time as green or climate, environmental transition, and it's particularly the case for European banks. And I think that if we, scale down at the European level, and in particular in France, as Marguerite explained, it's a very sensitive issue because we had this specific moment a few years ago with the yellow vest, the gilets jaunes. That was actually, I think, just the reflection of something larger. The trigger was the carbon tax, but people were not complaining exclusively about the carbon tax. Their complaints were much larger, and the main reason is the lack of redistribution of profits and of benefits. And to put the burden of the ecological transition on the most vulnerable was really perceived as something that was completely unacceptable. And the moment that we're living at the moment in France is not far from what we lived a few years back, but not linked to ecology or any specific climate transition. So going back to the banks, there are things that are being done at the European level, but it's very individual, I would say. So there's not a common approach today, but I can mention a few. So it's high on the political agenda, and there's a big push I would say, in several European countries to actually make sure that the financial community addresses the just transition. That's actually one of the reasons for including in the CSRD, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, several standards on social impacts, targeting the own workforce, the workforce in the value chain, the impacted communities as well. So that's just a disclosure brick, but it will give a lot of it will give companies the obligation to actually disclose what they actually do from a social perspective. There was also an attempt to develop the social taxonomy at the European level. We've heard recently that it will probably not happen with this European Commission, but it will eventually happen at some point, and that will be a very interesting attempt to actually to have a common definition of what a social impacts or what a social acceptability target should mean at the European level. Individually, at the banks level, what I can mention is that banks have European banks globally, and I can probably more speak from the French banking perspective because that's what I know best. All of the French banks have to date made very strong commitments to their teams and clients, but to society as a whole together. So it's more a principle-based type of commitment. But this being said, there are very strong support for the most vulnerable through financial inclusion. And that's particularly true from some banks like La Banque Postale, for whom it's really, it's in its DNA to include, to work on social, on financial inclusion for the most vulnerable people. A strong support for the économie sociale et solidaire. I'm not sure how to translate that in English, but social and solidarity economy, probably. The promotion also of equal opportunity, diversity, and human rights. So all banks have policy to defend that. In their own workforce, all banks will have developed internal practices to develop reskilling and upskilling. I mean, the banking sector is transforming as well. So upskilling is very key for the own workforce. We also mentioned governance and the inclusion of ESG dimension in the remuneration of the leaders, I would say mostly in banks. This being said, it's usually called ESG, but it's most likely to be climate or environmental targets. And it's very complicated to have social targets, although I'm seeing diversity objectives as well. So we're slowly getting there as well. And finally, I would say the inclusion of social objectives in the products being developed. So in the financing being provided, and that's maybe to answer to Stéphane, some of the financial products are also including social objective by design. That's the case of, for example, social bonds or social loans. I agree it's a very small market, much smaller than green bonds and green loans, but it is there. And I think French banks are the leaders on social bond development. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact figures. So products being developed by design, and also increasingly for all products going to, for which a credit decision is being made, the inclusion of a social impact risk measure. Measure is probably not the right word because there's actually not a metric behind that, but a social impact appreciation. So whenever you go to a credit committee with a credit decision to be made in a bank, in a French bank, and most of the European banks, you have what I call, not banks don't always call it this way, but an ESG KYC. So an evaluation of a know your client, which is focused on environment, social and governance impacts, and social is there, definitely. So we're increasingly getting there. What we're missing today is a harmonization. So for all banks to have the same approach, and for that, we would probably need that European taxonomy.
Okay, thank you. So just to conclude, I will give back the floor to Pierre. So whether you have a reaction to what has been said, and perhaps, as you have seen, it's still something to expect, not really yet in practice, although Karen presented some individual approaches. And the fact that when we look at the governance issue, I agree with Patricia that when you look at the incentives which are provided to the managers mostly, the link with social issues or aspect is fairly limited to only a couple of indicators, and it's not always clear what weight is provided to that indicator. So Pierre, as a final word, perhaps what would be the key aspect for you to foster the work on just transition?
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Excellent. I mean, I don't have much to add in general. Again, I have my my vision or my point of view from financial regulators and central banks, and would like to highlight 2 or 3 things that have been said. First, I think as Stefan highlighted, I think central banks and financial supervisors are extremely well placed to stop or to go deeper than having an aggregate vision of the economy. Since a few years now, there have been a lot of models that have been developed based on heterogeneous agent models. And now there are kind of standards in the toolkits of central banks. And these kind of models are really useful to highlight distributive issue and to also understand how financial markets have distributional effect. How does that play out? And I think highlighting that, making that public and educating people about how that works in the distributional issue works in the economy could be a great contribution. And also there is a lack of metrics. It's clear that carbon emission are very useful because that's the metrics everybody can use. Maybe here the solution is not to have one single metrics, but at least central banks and financial supervisors can help finding like just transition or inequality measures that can be served as target for many other financial or policy authorities. When it comes to financial regulators, Laurent, since you said I was talking more about central bankers, I think for financial supervisors, here, as it was highlighted in the last round of comments, I think financial supervisors can also play a very useful role in highlighting and checking what banks are doing. So how should they report in terms of their contribution to a just transition or their impact on distributional issues? I think here we could agree on a framework on how to report for that, so that at least there is some clarity about what is the positive or negative contribution of banks. And with that, the next step after highlighting that is to set maybe supervisory expectation about what should be done. And to come back to the first remark, to be very concrete, we have 2 practical ways to do that, to do something. So including, for example, including labor force representative in the board is one solution. Having an incentive for remuneration is also incentive. I think here financial supervisors can set these guidelines on how to do that. And more generally, I think central banks and financial supervisors can also use their convening powers to make sure that in different circles where policy decisions are made, that everybody is represented, or that also, for example, unions or representative of communities are represented in the gremium that kind of set or shape the policy agenda. So that could be concrete things that financial supervisors and central banks could do. But it's only the beginning of the way, of their way, and I think even if it's a marginal contribution, any marginal contribution is useful, is needed there. There is no silver bullet to solve it, and to solve the just transition, or to make sure that the just transition happen, and it should be part of a package of policy decision, which include also the monetary policy and financial regulation decisions.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. So we have to stop now the panel. So I would like to thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Patricia, Marguerite, Karen, and Stéphane. And so now I think there is our cafe break. Or shorten the cafe break. Sorry for that. Okay, so thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.